The content in this video is extremely sexual in nature, so maybe watch one of my other videos on medical history if you don't want to sit through this one. Otherwise, sit back as we go through the history of the G-spot.
The Gräfenberg spot is a sensitive area that we have found in the anterior wall of the vagina. It's located right about in this area.
If you stimulate this area, what happens, the orgasm occurs very rapidly, usually within a minute. And people often report that they have many orgasms, frequently.
That woman just speaking there was Beverly Whipple, the woman who announced in 1981 that she had just discovered a tiny magical area in the female body that would change their sex lives forever. She named it the G-spot. It has become a cultural phenomenon ever since her bold announcement, with the majority of both men and women believing in its existence. And many women put a tremendous amount of effort into finding their G-spot. But does it really exist? Well, who better to answer this question than myself, a male doctor who isn't even a gynecologist. But don't worry, I've gone through all the relevant literature about the G-spot, and I'm pretty sure you will be satisfied with my answer by the end of the video. So to find out if the G-spot truly does exist, let's first take a look at its history. So first things first, we need to define what the G-spot is. It's an extremely sensitive area located at the front wall of the vagina that can lead to a deep and intense orgasm when stimulated, sometimes even to the point of ejaculation. The best way to find it is by mimicking the "come here" gesture with your hand. So why is the existence of the G-spot so controversial, you might be asking? Well, most of the contemporary knowledge of human sexual physiology stems from the famous work of Masters and Johnson in the 1960s. This research team revolutionized sexology by carefully observing hundreds of people having intercourse in lab conditions and collecting their data for research purposes. One of their main findings was that there's a single primary source of female orgasms, which is from direct stimulation of the clitoris and not the vagina. However, 20 years after this research, the G-spot introduced the belief that women might also be able to achieve an orgasm from vaginal stimulation alone. But hints of this belief is by no means a modern idea. One of the earliest surviving historical references is from an 8th century Chinese poem which described an erogenous zone in the anterior vaginal wall that produces a whitish fluid when stimulated. And moving a bit forward in time to the early 20th century, we hear from the man known for his many theories about sex, Sigmund Freud. In his papers discussing female sexual development, he made a clear distinction between a clitoral orgasm and a vaginal orgasm. But Beverly Whipple is the person who would really bring this idea into the mainstream. She was born and raised in America and initially qualified as a nurse before eventually expanding into teaching and research. Her discovery came in 1979 when a woman who had been suffering for many years from urinary stress incontinence came to her clinic to see her. This woman reported that her incontinence also happened during orgasms, and she's even had to train herself to hold it in during them, so that she doesn't wet the bed. But once Whipple and her colleagues performed a vaginal examination on her, something strange occurred. When the anterior part of the vagina was stimulated, the woman experienced an orgasm that felt quote-unquote deeper than usual, which caused a violent expulsion of fluid from the urethra. The examiners also found that her anterior vagina grew by 50% during this time, and that there were some substances in the fluid that you wouldn't find in standard urine. So maybe this wasn't just ordinary pee. A light bulb lit up inside of Whipple's head from these findings, and she started searching through the recent scientific literature to see if anyone before her had observed anything similar to what she just witnessed. She eventually found a paper from 1950 by a German gynecologist called Ernst Gräfenberg, who was well known for his previous work on intrauterine devices. But in this particular paper from 1950, Gräfenberg described the existence of a quote, erotic zone on the anterior wall of the vagina along the course of the urethra. This was exactly what Beverly Whipple's research team was looking for, and they dubbed this area the Gräfenberg spot, which was later shortened to its now famous name. A larger study on 11 more women was published to back up the findings from the initial case study, and Whipple released a book in 1982 called The G-Spot and Other Recent Discoveries About Human Sexuality. It immediately went as viral as things could do back then, instantly entering the New York Times bestsellers list, and was also an international hit, with the book being translated into 19 different languages. And ever since the publication of the book, the ability to find the G-spot is seen as being vital if you want to truly enjoy sex, mainly due to just how much the mainstream media propagate this viewpoint. But there's one thing wrong. If you go onto Google right now and do an image search of the G-spot, all you can see are dots and arrows pointing to where on the vagina the G-spot is supposed to be. But that area at the front looks strangely similar in appearance to everywhere else on the vagina. So as you might expect, Beverly Whipple and her team had some skeptics, and as the scientific method dictates you should do, other researchers quickly got to work to verify if the G-spot truly did exist. Like my definition at the beginning of the video, and the one given by Whipple herself, to prove beyond doubt that the G-spot is real, you firstly need to demonstrate that there's a sensitive area in the anterior vaginal wall, and you must secondly prove that it can cause an orgasm, distinct from the clitoral one. The ejaculation part isn't really a necessity, but it will further add to your case. The many studies that have been conducted since Whipple's discovery have gone about searching for it using a number of different ways, whether it was by careful observation of sexual behaviour, closely inspecting the anatomy, or applying radiological techniques. But unfortunately, they have all come up short. Let me expand on this. Studies have been performed that involved a close-up anatomical dissection of the vagina down to the cellular level, but they found no difference in the structure of the anterior vagina compared to elsewhere, and they were also unable to find any bundle of nerves around the supposed G-spot region. That would be another way to explain its apparent role in orgasms. And imaging using either MRI or ultrasound machines have also failed to reliably find any difference, with these scans showing that orgasms only happened when the clitoris was stimulated, even when there was direct vaginal penetration, which should stimulate the G-spot. So what gives? Is the existence of the G-spot actually a myth? Well, let's take a close inspection of Whipple's initial 2 papers on the G-spot. The first study was on a single woman who had a prolapsed bladder, which perfectly explains her incontinence. And this prolapsed bladder could have easily bulged into the anterior vaginal wall to bring about an apparent G-spot, but you can't really say that's representative of all women. And the second study from Whipple's team was a quote, sexological exam, where they palpated the entire vagina in a clockwise fashion, and then asked them if any part felt more sensitive than usual. But get this, Only 4 out of the 11 women in the study actually reported a significant difference in sensation in the place that the G-spot was meant to be, hardly enough to conclusively say that it does exist. And if you look back to the 1950 paper from Ernst Gräfenberg, who was the inspiration for the term, even he provides no direct evidence for the G-spot. What he does say in this paper is that the anterior area is more sensitive based on, quote, my own experience of numerous women. He might be a well-respected gynecologist, but anecdotes just don't pass the test, even from someone like him. So that means that the entire scientific foundation of the G-spot rests on 3 things: a case study of a woman with abnormal anatomy, sexological examinations that didn't even lead to orgasms, and the anecdotes of a single doctor. You can still find many prominent G-spot supporters attempting to prove that it is real, but the sample sizes are just way too small, or whatever they've claimed to find simply hasn't been able to be repeated under scrutiny. And please, don't get me started on the other spots in the vagina that some people have also claimed to exist. So what do we make of this? Has this doctor speaking to you ruined sex forever? How do we reconcile the fact that many women swear that they do have a G-spot against the many studies that have failed to find it? Well, the increased sensitivity of the anterior vagina is actually because of how close it is to the clitoris. If you take a deep look at the clitoris, it's actually a fairly large structure with 2 long arms, and it even has parts that extend into and around the vagina. And because of the incredibly dense nerve supply of the clitoris, even the pressure and sensation from typical penetrative sex can sometimes stimulate it and cause an orgasm. So as it turns out, what many women think is the G-spot is simply just an extension of the clitoris, and even Beverly Whipple herself has moved away from the term, and she has now given this area a new name, the clito-urethro-vaginal complex. So in conclusion, the G-spot doesn't exist in the way that many people think it does. But why does it matter? Well, for 2 reasons. Firstly, since the announcement of the G-spot in 1982, a huge industry around it was created, with things like G-spot vibrators or G-spot amplification surgery, which is quite expensive and doesn't have any evidence backing it, but might end up being an unnecessary use of money. And secondly, because of the media's intense obsession with the spot, many women might wrongly feel like they are abnormal for not having one, and it might make men feel inadequate if they can't find it during sex. What I do suggest is we should just enjoy intercourse no matter how the pleasure is achieved, rather than searching for one single magical area. The G-spot simply doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint either, because imagine what the act of childbirth would do to it. But despite all the evidence I've presented against it in this video, I suspect that the belief in the G-spot will go on, and people will still go looking for it, because it's so hard to prove a negative. But for now, the G-spot remains the UFO of gynecology, long searched for, but still yet to be found.